I'm Pastor David Miller, and I'm excited to share with you an opportunity that we have here at First United Methodist Church. Currently, our church is considering opening a second campus at the current site of the Red Brick Church on 5th Avenue North. I use those words specifically. We're looking to open a campus in Kenwood. The Kenwood neighborhood runs from 9th Avenue North to Central Avenue, from the interstate out to 34th Street. That's historic Kenwood, and North Kenwood runs up to 22nd Avenue North. So opening a campus in that particular neighborhood, and a campus in that it would be a second site of our church's ministry. I think of universities who have separate campuses that fall under the same umbrella of one university. This is, in essence, what we're talking about doing. This would be a church plant and not a church merger. Along the way, we have talked to several churches about the opportunity of joining with us and being a part of a new ministry in the Kenwood neighborhood. But the churches we've talked to have decided not to pursue that. And so what we're suggesting is that we as a church ourselves start a second site that will be fully First United Methodist Church. It would be a part of our ministry that would remain a part of our church. Our church has a great tradition and history. We've been a part of starting several churches, 5 in our past, in this area. If you drive past Riviera United Methodist Church or Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, those are churches that our church helped to start. We provided resources and we sent them on their way to become a sister church. This is not the model that we're talking about. We're talking about having a church ministry in a different location at the same time, as opposed to what we do now in many different ways of having church ministries at different times in the same location. So we're talking about one church in several places. Our goal is to offer ministry that shares values but not fingerprints. We have a number of things that we do really well here. God is blessing our church, causing our church to grow. We are proud of our focus on the study of the Bible, on discipleship, on being a multi-generational church, on being invested in missions around the world. And these are things that we believe God is calling us to share beyond our current location. But we are not interested in starting a ministry that looks exactly the same. The goal is not to have 2 McDonald's that look exactly the same, just miles apart down the road, but rather a ministry that would look slightly different so as to reach out to a different audience. The story that I have been sharing with members in our church has a story that is about 2 camels that were on a trade caravan through the desert and come to find themselves passing through a river. The first camel is carrying salt, and the second camel is carrying cotton. And the first camel emerges from the river refreshed. The water has washed away some of the salt, and he has a lighter burden and is revived. The second camel comes out and collapses from exhaustion because the water has filled the cotton, and he is now overloaded. And the idea is that one church cannot meet the needs of every person, that because of the different experiences that we have, the different burdens that we carry, the different type of lives that we live, one church for one person could be refreshing the message of the gospel and the way they present it. For another, in their experience, it might be a burden. And so there's value in offering different types of ministry to reach different types of people in various places in their lives. So we want something that looks a little different, but is always built on the same core message and the same core values that we have here at First United Methodist Church. And of course, one of the main goals of this is to share resources, to leverage the things that we've been given to be more effective. Better together is the phrase, where we have the opportunity to join forces with another ministry center that offers a broader scope of grace. Particularly, we would look at 5 areas to focus on in this Kenwood campus ministry. The first would be the ministry at St. Petersburg High School. This is a high school that is dear in many ways to many members of our church. Many attended school there. Many have their children or grandchildren attend there. And we feel called with our multi-generational church to really be inviting and focusing and reaching out to and being grace in Christ to the students at that high school. And there are a number of folks that have approached us since this dialogue began that have said, we've been praying that this type of ministry would begin, that you would be interested in helping the schools in this type of outreach. Second, we would be focusing on contemporary worship, and this would be a type of worship that would not be exactly the same as our contemporary worship. In the church world, our contemporary worship service is actually 2 generations behind, that there are actually 2 different types of contemporary worship that have come along after our contemporary worship. And so we'd look for a style that would be edgier, perhaps less formal, less structured, that would reach out to generations that have come behind us and really connect with them. The recovery ministry is certainly dear to our church, and it's important in that particular neighborhood. There are a number of large 12-step programs. We believe Celebrate Recovery has a tremendous way of connecting people to Christ as that higher power, and it has the ability to bring people into the church and to help them connect with a broader body. And so we would look to replicate a Celebrate Recovery type of ministry, particularly one that focused on the landing, that is the youth or young adult version of recovery ministry. One of the ministries that has been in conversation here at First United Methodist Church is a School of the Arts. That is a ministry that brings in different teachers and coaches and mentors to help people learn to excel in the arts, perhaps of music, perhaps of singing, drama instruments, painting, those type of things, where we learn to really worship God through all of our senses. And through this ministry, people and families would be connected to the church, they would be drawn into the family, and they would begin to use their gifts that God has given them in different ministries within the body. For example, a young child that comes through our School of Arts could grow up to become part of our worship team and lead in worship as they go through this outreach. Our final focus would be on life application groups, and this falls right in line with our 6-year vision and our focus right now on connecting people to small groups. We believe that disciples walk it's critical to have a smaller group to connect with and to live out that application of faith. And so we believe in that, and we're looking to do the same type of ministry there, but with a different twist. That is to be more focused on life application skills. It could be Christian parenting or how to manage our money as Christian stewards. There is a cost to this opportunity, and there are resources for that opportunity. First of all, because it is a church plant and not merging of churches, the United Methodist Conference here in Florida and the district in which we live, in the region in which our church lies, has promised $300,000 over 3 years towards this ministry outreach, about $100,000 a year for 3 years. The 3-year mark is important because it is our goal to have this campus income match its expenses, or to be pretty neutral on the overall budget impact by the end of 3 years. And so we're aiming for that 3-year mark. Second, we're asking our church family to match that gift, to itself give $300,000 over 3 years, or about $100,000 a year. Our giving offering here at the church is $2 million a year, so that equals about 5% of our offering on an annual basis. There's another resource that's available to this, that is the property that is at the site of the current Red Brick Church on 5th Avenue. Over the years, the building on that site has become unusable, but the property is valuable, not only for its location near the high school, but in just its basic worth. And if we were to vote to take this outreach on, the property would become our church's possession, and we would be free to use that as we felt called to do that. If for some reason we found there was a better location to be in that type of ministry in that neighborhood, we could sell the property and use that resource. That's the type of trust that the higher church has put in our church in asking us to look at this. Of course, all of that really is nothing compared to the true gift that we need to look at, which is the gift of ourselves. Emerson has this great quote, "Rings and jewels are not gifts, but apologies for gifts. The only gift is a portion of thyself." And so what we're asking you to do is to pray and consider if you would be willing to pray and to invest yourself into this type of outreach yourself. Here's what would happen if our church decided to pursue this. We would have a vote on September 24th. It would be a church conference. Every church member will be invited to participate. And if we decide to pursue this, then at the beginning of 2014, an associate pastor would be appointed. This pastor would come from the conference and would become the campus pastor in the Kenwood area, would be the pastor that would primarily be associated with that campus, but would also have a part in leading ministry throughout our whole family. And we would look for this pastor to oversee the send or mission area of our whole family and to bring leadership that way. Then around Easter of 2014, we would launch worship in the St. Petersburg High School itself. If the building's unusable, we'll have to find another place to meet, and the school has provided past churches a great opportunity to be immersed in that community. Personally, I've been a part of starting a church, and we started in the school, and it really helped us connect with just an important part of what happens in every community. You know, schools today are given so much responsibility with children to help raise them and watch over them and to guide them, that the church really has a great calling to be a part of what they're doing. And so starting in the school allows us to interact with the teachers and the students and the leadership there. And personally, I've found that that brings students and teachers into the new start of the church. It's important to start with Sunday worship because that becomes the driving force for resources. It's a necessary part to be able to offer other things like recovery ministry and youth ministry, things you could not offer on your own unless there was a body that had gathered together in worship. To do that, there are really three major components that fall into that launch of that worship service. And the bottom line goal would be to have 125 people in worship right away throughout that first year. That goal is important because it builds that critical mass. My experience has been that when you start a service or a ministry of that type in worship that is less than that 100 mark, that ministry will continually struggle to break that gap, to bridge that plateau. It might, but it'll be a lot harder and take a lot longer. And so the idea is to have a critical mass of 100, 125 people the very first year. And the way we're going to do that is this. Should we adopt this, we would start with 4 small ownership groups in the Kenwood area. These are connection groups or small groups that meet regularly in that neighborhood to be in study and to be in relationship and accountability, but also would be asked to take on a part of the launch of the church. So we would go to the first group and say, hey, would you, besides meeting, take on the ministry of the nursery? Help us discover how we can offer a nursery ministry while we worship. And we would go to the second group and say, could you help us look at how we offer ministry at Sunday school while we're meeting on Sunday morning? So that by the time we launched, there would be 40 to 50 people in community connected to one another in that Kenwood neighborhood who had investment in what was coming. Second, there is a group from our sister church at Christ United Methodist Church that has been in this conversation about coming to join us in this. This is something that came out of their process about whether they wanted to join us or not, and there is a contemporary service there who has said, yes, we want to be a part of this new opportunity. And so 20 to 30 people from Christ United Methodist Church, as well as a number of youth, are going to be a part of this process if we decide to do this. Finally, we would have a marketing campaign, and what that would involve is going door to door in the Kenwood neighborhood and saying simply, would you be interested in receiving some information about our new church here in Kenwood? Just one question, would you like to receive some information? And we'll take those names and create a mailing list and do a series of mailers to invite them to the launch of worship around Easter. And what we've discovered through past experience of other churches is that this brings a percentage of folks who will come and show up. And this is indeed what I found when I started a church, that a percentage, about 1% of the mailers we send out respond and people coming to check out what is happening. So 40 to 50 people and 20, 30 people from Christ and a percentage from the marketing should help us reach our goal of 125 in worship. We should be well on our way. There are some challenges, and I think there's always challenges when you're called to do something God-sized. If it's something we can just do ourselves and it's easy, the way I read the Scripture, it probably isn't from God. God always calls us to extend and stretch. And the first challenge is to get past this idea that church is just for me. We live in a culture where it's primarily focused on what is in it for me and what do I deserve and how do I experience and is it arranged around my likes and I'm the consumer. And that certainly influences the experience at church. And so one of the challenges we would have is to get past that and remember that church as a community is really about being servants, or as Paul says, slaves to one another, to serve one another in love. And so that would be a challenge for us. Any organization, I think particularly churches over time, has to overcome the challenge to be focused on self-preservation. Now, we like what we have here. The church has blessed us. I was married in this church. My children were baptized in this church. I want to keep what's here because I really am blessed by it. And if that becomes the primary focus of the church, well, then we begin to slowly die. And we've seen this even in our own community of churches that have become solely focused on keeping what they have. And Christ has already told us that as soon as you seek to save in this thing called the walk of a disciple, you're going to lose. It's the downward slope if we want to settle for self-preservation. Apathy is another challenge. I think there's a real danger if a number of our family here says, oh, that's great, go ahead and do it. You guys take care of it, and I don't really care if you do this or not. That's not what we're called to be as a family. It's certainly one of the challenges we have here in our family. And so one of the things I'll be looking for is that the majority of our church family will be excited and invested about doing this. Leadership is always an ongoing process and need in our church, and certainly one that we continually work to do better at, and having a second campus will just increase that leadership need. My thought is that when you get into launching a new ministry like a second campus, that it does tend to draw a different type of leader. Having started a church, I found that those who came to the church when it was formed were really those much more interested in pioneering, those that were very interested in being in the ground floor to form something. The need for structure and walls and the ceiling and all the rest were not present for them or as much of a driving need. And so it's our hope that as we go into this place, we'll not only reach a different audience, but we'll also reach a different type of leader who might not find that niche here at our current church. Integration is the final challenge that I'll offer. How do we become one church in several locations? How do we worship in different places and yet share records and share vision and share message and share staff and share leadership and share ministry resources? That is something that we'll have to talk a lot about and figure out how we do that. But this is not a new model. It's being done in our area by other United Methodist churches. Nona United Methodist Church is one that's doing this. There are churches in Fort Myers and Boca Raton and Fort Lauderdale and Gainesville that are all involved in this type of new model for the United Methodist Church. But it's not a new model overall. This has been a model, this church multi-site, multi-campus church approach has been in other denominations and non-denominational churches for a good 15 to 20 years. There are costs. One of the costs to me is letting go of the paradigm that the church is a building and the church meets in one place at one location at one time. And there is certainly some undercurrent of that within our own family. When we have such a beautiful sanctuary, when we have such a wonderful place to worship, we know that a lot of time and energy and focus has gone into creating that type of place that endures. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens is that remains the focus or becomes the focus. And the temptation then is to think of church as being here. And we'll have to give up that paradigm and begin to see the church is the body, it's the people, and where it's in ministry and not just the location. Second, we'll have to work on our temptation here at First United Methodist Church to silo ministries, to talk about my ministry and to let other ministries do their thing, but really to become a true community which shares what we have based upon that first century church where they met together in homes and shared their resources as the body of Christ. And we will have to overcome that, and that will cost some of us ministry as we're used to doing it. There is a cost of not doing this. Someone posed this to me, and I thought it was a great question. I believe our church stands at a very important time in its history where we're going to need to decide if we're going to be invested in preserving what we have or in reaching out and growing the kingdom. And if this is not the opportunity that we feel called to pursue, my question is going to be, then what? What are we called to do that will help us live beyond ourselves? There is a cost if we decide not to reach out. It is the beginning, in my mind, of the downward slope to a slow closure. There are many ways for you to get involved. We ask you to get involved. First of all, we ask everyone to please pray. Prayer is so important and the foundation of what we're doing. Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds a house, its builders labor in vain. Unless God's in this, then it's really for nothing. It's really pointless. And so please pray that we would follow God's will for our church in this opportunity. Also, I ask you to please share with others the things that I'm sharing with you. Let them know about this site. Let them know about the message. Let them know what God is calling us to do so they can make up their own mind and follow their heart as they pray to God about His direction. We're always looking for folks that would like to be a part of those ownership teams in Kenwood, and certainly there's a lay leadership team. All of this comes through a lay leadership team. They would love to have you participate in that. And of course, please be present on September 24th to vote as a church family. We have been involved in a prayer walk in the Kenwood neighborhood. You may have heard that on Sunday or seen it in the bulletin. That came out of an opportunity that one of our lay members brought to us. It was a book called Circle Maker, in which a pastor in Washington, D.C. walked around the area that he was going to claim for Christ as he started a church. It was based upon the story of the Israelites walking around Jericho in the Promised Land, waiting for God's provision. And so we embraced this, and for 7 weeks we began to walk throughout the neighborhood of Kenwood, to stop and to pray at various points, to greet people that live there, to just learn what is happening in that neighborhood. And it was really a gift. It reminded us that people live in that neighborhood, people that God loves and want Him to know, and people that need God's grace. It's easy to drive right down Fifth Avenue and just think that Kenwood is about a bunch of businesses or a school, but there is a vibrant neighborhood there filled with people who need Christ. And this is ultimately what we're talking about. We're talking about folks who need to know what we have found, life that transcends life, grace and love in God. Couple of whys. Certainly there's a Great Commission in which God calls us to go and make disciples. That's our whole mandate. What I like to think of is the fact that Christ started with saying, go and make disciples, and He ended with, the scriptures end with this picture in Revelation where all of the universe is gathered around the throne of Christ in the new heaven on earth. And that's where we're headed. That's what we believe is going to happen. As Christians, we believe that God is drawing all of history to a point around the throne of Christ where every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. We believe that's going to happen. And here's our opportunity to be a part of that, to be a part of God's new order of life. And this is what this presents for me. Second, why? Because it reminds us of our purpose. You may have seen the video that we've shown in worship service about the life-saving station that was started on a coast where shipwrecks often occurred. And day and night, crews would go out to rescue those who were in peril from drowning with the shipwrecks. Over time, this great work grew, and more crews were brought along, and more boats were brought in to help save people. After a while, people began to contribute money and resources to this great outreach, and so they used them to build a great facility. They noticed that things were lacking in that outreach, and so they built this tremendous life-saving station. It was such a nice place that people used it as a place to gather. They began to come and just to hang out, as they treated it as a club. And as they began to do that, they began to be less and less interested in going out and doing life-saving work. And they thought about it, and they began to hire professional crews to go out and do the work for them. Well, as the story goes, after a time, they began to notice the wear and tear on this beautiful club. The carpet was frayed, the walls were marked up, and they began to talk about whether they should do that work at all. They certainly had a room where a lifeboat was kept, and there were, artifacts from the work, but maybe they weren't called to do that anymore after all. Well, about that time, a big shipwreck occurred off the coast, and the crews brought in boatloads of hungry and wet and tired people. Immediately, the property committee got together and took a vote and decided that people should shower off before they came into the beautiful club. The next month, the club called a vote. Should they remain in this work at all? Because it seemed to destroy their beautiful club. And it was decided that those that wanted to could go down the coast and start their own life-saving station, and that they, the club themselves, remained just a club. Well, as the story goes, history repeated itself, and the same thing happened. The life-saving station grew up in its work. It became professional. It then became more focused on preserving what they had. And a new life-saving station was started down the coast. And so that today, if you go to that coast, you see a number of these clubs that were once life-saving stations. But now when people are shipwrecked and drowned, nobody comes. It's the allegory for the church. We are called to make disciples, and it's easy to lose that purpose as we get involved in keeping what we have. And this is an opportunity to really move beyond that. C.S. Lewis has a great quote: "The church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them into little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, and even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time." Our ultimate purpose is to make little Christ, to help people come into the very image of Christ. Another why for me is that it helps us remain countercultural. Our culture tells us that we have the right to get what we want exactly when we want it, to have it our way. But this is not at all, if we read the scripture, what the church is called to be or to stand for. It is about serving rather than being served. That's what Christ said: "I came to serve rather than to be served." And no servant is greater than his or her master. And so this is our opportunity to really stand for that, to put our money where our mouth is, and to say it's not about my way, it's about your way or our way together collectively, about Christ's way most of all. Certainly, a why is the fact that Christ died for us and calls us to give ourselves away. Didn't he say, after all, that if you want to follow me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me? For whoever would save their life will lose it. And it's in the losing of our life that we actually find life. And it's true for us as a church. It's in the giving away of our life as a church that we actually find life. Thank you for taking time to let me learn more facts about what I've discussed, and also to look at some frequently asked questions. I know that you have some questions, and I encourage you to spend time in exploring this as you pray and discern what God is calling us to do. Before you go, though, I'd like to share with you one last story. This is a picture of the Israelites crossing into the Promised Land on their second attempt. Now, you remember that the Israelites came to the edge of God's promise, the Promised Land, and they sent the 12 spies over, and 10 came back and said, "No, we can't go. The people are giants. It'll be dangerous. It'll be the death of us." And yet Joshua and Caleb said, "Yes, God has promised us this inheritance," but that the Israelites ultimately chose not to cross the Jordan. And as a result, that generation did not experience God's blessing as he had designed it for them. Actually, the generation wandered for another 40 years until they had perished. So they're at the banks of the Jordan River at the edge of the Promised Land a second time, and God comes to Joshua and says, "Put the priests in front of the people carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they're to walk into the middle of the Jordan River, and when they walk into the water, I will part the water, and you'll be able to cross over to your inheritance in safety." Well, that story really resonates with me because along the way of this process, I have wanted God to part the water before we walked into the river, into God's opportunity. I've wanted to have other churches come and to say that they'll bring the resources that are needed. I've wanted other folks to say, absolutely, we'll provide the leadership, so that it would be very little imposition for us as a church to pursue this. But all along the way, God has continually said to me, that's not how it works. It's faith that is required. Walk into the water first. And this is what I think our church is called to do. I believe we're called to pursue this opportunity, that God has laid out for us a great inheritance, and that if we will show faith, he will part the water and draw us into what he has promised. I just invite you to prayerfully consider this, to join us, and I thank you, and I ask you to pray that God would help us to be faithful to being his church.